They said her name like it was dirt, laughed at her weight, mocked her voice, called her diversity hire like it was a joke everyone was in on but her. In a room full of polished handshakes and white collars, they treated her like background noise, loud, unwanted, forgettable. But what they never asked was why she never fought back, why she never flinched, why she let them pile on every insult like bricks, quietly building her case. This isn't just a story. It's a reckoning wrapped in skin they tried to erase. If this hit something in you, like the video, subscribe, and tell us, what scene cut the deepest, and where are you watching from? The silence is over. Celine Ward arrived at Trivant Solutions' 37th floor orientation, suite 2 minutes past 8, a deliberate choice. Early enough to show respect, late enough to not appear eager. The air in the lobby was crisp with a scent of filtered air and polished ambition. 10 other recruits sat in full leather chairs, all clutching Trivant's branded folders and dressed in their carefully curated business identities. Celine moved with a quiet precision. Her slate gray suit was bespoke, not flamboyant, but expertly tailored. Her natural coils were pulled back in a controlled twist, not tight but elegant, framing high cheekbones and eyes that had seen far too much to be impressed by corporate glass walls. Still, she offered a polite nod to the receptionist, who barely looked up before motioning her toward the waiting cluster. The moment Celine entered the orientation room, the temperature shifted, not physically, but socially. Conversations that had been humming dulled into guarded glances. A few of the other hires, mostly white, shifted slightly in their seats. Some smiled in that distant way, acknowledging without inviting. Celine sat without reacting, setting her bag on her lap. She had seen this act in other offices, other elevators, other briefings. It wasn't new. It just always stung the same way. When Blythe Randall strode in, her entrance was marked not by presence, but performance. Crimson blazer, tight-cut slacks, heels like steel, and a stare that scanned the room not for talent, but for misalignment. Her gaze flicked across the group and halted, unsubtle, on Celine. She paused. No words, just a slight tilt of the head and a curl at the corner of her mouth. Then, as if discussing furniture, she turned to her assistant and instructed him to bring in another chair, one that wouldn't, in her words, sag under extra stress. Her voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. The way she cut her eyes and the slow, deliberate phrasing made sure the message landed with everyone in the room. Celine felt the breath hitch in her chest but didn't flinch. A male intern chuckled under his breath. Blythe didn't scold him. Instead, she began the orientation with a smug smile, calling out 2 hires for their Ivy League glow and 1 woman for her executive sharpness. When it came time to introduce Celine, Blythe glanced at the papers in her hand, gave a fake "ah," then said, "And this is Selena," before waving vaguely in her direction. No correction was invited. No attention lingered. Then came the group exercise. The new hires were to form teams of 3 and work on a simulated crisis scenario. Blythe divided them up, calling out names quickly. When it came to Celine, she paused, then added in a tone that barely masked disdain, "And you'll be working solo, Ms. Ward. Simulating high-pressure, loan accountability situations. Good practice for someone adjusting." Celine gave a small nod and turned to her assigned task. Her laptop opened in silence. Her typing, quick and methodical. She noticed the glances, some pitying, some smug, a few uncomfortable. But not one person objected. Not one asked why she was being separated. At lunch, the others clustered near the glass wall overlooking the skyline. Small talk about business podcasts, peletometrics, and family beach homes floated around like perfume. Celine walked to the catering table, only to find the vegetarian options gone. She quietly made a plate of fruit and water, then sat at the back near the emergency exit. It didn't escape her that 2 interns took one look at the seat beside her and opted to eat, standing up. When Blythe passed by, she leaned toward another manager and said just audible enough, "That's the problem with optics over merit. No sense of how to integrate, always isolates herself." That afternoon, the mock board meeting played out in the central conference hall. Celine, having completed the individual portion faster than expected, sat in to observe. Halfway through a presentation by one of the teams, she raised her hand with a suggestion about pivot strategies during PR crises. Blythe cut her off before she finished her second sentence. "We're looking for applicable insights, not theoretical commentary." 10 minutes later, a male hire repeated Celine's point nearly word for word. Blythe clapped and praised his natural instinct. As the session ended, Blythe handed out feedback cards. Some were handed with both hands, some with brief words of encouragement. When she reached Celine, she simply placed the card face down and said, "Keep working at it." The elevator ride was silent, lined with recruits exchanging casual chatter. None directed her way. On the 22nd floor, the onboarding room felt colder, emptier. Everyone had a stack of documents on their desks, the same white folders from yesterday. Everyone except her. Instead, her folder was crimson, a different color, a different message. A post-it was attached. "Please report to Compliance Office A before beginning onboarding packet." No one else received that instruction. She tucked the note inside the folder and headed down the hall. At Compliance, a woman named Trina, young, cheery, and clearly uncomfortable, greeted her with overly rehearsed enthusiasm and gestured for her to sit. Papers were already spread out across the desk. Trina explained, in the most delicate voice possible, that Celine would need to resubmit her full background check documentation. When asked why, Trina hesitated, then said it was due to systemic inconsistencies linked to her surname in the Federal Verification Database. Celine blinked once. "My name's Ward," she replied, her voice calm. "Is that a problematic surname?" Trina blushed. "No, it's just... Well, the software flags anomalies based on regional identifiers, and it sometimes confuses less common profiles." The implication hung in the air like smoke, code for racial profiling masked under technical jargon. No other new hire was asked to resubmit. Celine scanned the list. All the documents were already uploaded to the system. Nothing was missing. Nothing had changed. Yet the process restarted for her alone. Back at her desk, she noticed another difference. A thick printed packet sat beside her orientation binder, a copy of Trivant's Employee Conduct Guide. Not digital like everyone else's. Hers was annotated with highlights, underlines, and hand-marked footnotes in red ink. The cover page read, "Personal Conduct Addendum Mandatory." She flipped through it slowly. The additional pages were riddled with absurd guidelines that weren't present in the company-wide document. "Avoid hairstyles that obscure facial expression," one line read. Another demanded professional tone modulation for phone and video interactions. Yet another line advised against expressive personal garments that may cause distraction. Celine's lips pressed into a thin line. This wasn't just targeted, it was weaponized subtlety. And it was deliberate. During a team huddle that afternoon, she noticed Blythe standing in the corner of the conference room, arms folded, gaze fixed in that calculating way. Blythe didn't speak much. She didn't need to. Her presence had already shaped how others perceived Celine, someone who needed more supervision, someone who was outside the norm, someone the rules needed to be written for. After the meeting, while most new hires gathered for a welcome coffee upstairs, Celine received an Outlook invite for a one-on-one compliance review with legal. No one else was summoned. The invite came from a senior HR analyst named Kenner, who, when she arrived at his office, didn't bother hiding his condescension. His tone was flat, his desk cluttered with compliance logs. He gestured toward a chair as if expecting her to sit silently and absorb whatever was coming. Without preamble, Kenner questioned the authenticity of one of her previous employment verifications, not because anything was missing, but because the company name was unfamiliar in corporate culture. She explained it was a boutique policy strategy firm in D.C. with limited media presence, but high-impact contracts. He raised an eyebrow. "Interesting," he muttered. "Very niche. A lot of nonprofits in that space, correct?" He didn't ask about her performance. He didn't ask about her credentials. He fixated on the names and addresses on the page. "We just need to be thorough," he added, his tone more performance than sincerity. As she left the room, Kenner's voice trailed after her. "We hold everyone to the same standard, Ms. Ward." But she knew that wasn't true. The standard shifted depending on who stood beneath it. Back at her desk, her inbox flooded with delay notices. Her onboarding portal, which should have granted her access to the company's internal systems, remained locked. When she reached out to IT, a technician named Dylan responded via chat, "Apologies, your access level has not been confirmed by Executive Ops. They flagged your profile for special credentialing." No one else had been flagged. She asked when it would be resolved. He replied with a shrug emoji and the line, "Probably soon. Just hang tight." She didn't react. She knew better. But beneath her silence was a current of rage, sharp and deliberate. At the end of the day, while most of the cohort departed together for rooftop drinks organized by team leads, Celine sat alone in the training room, filling out her revised background forms for the second time in 2 days. The hum of the HVAC above her head was the only sound left in the room. On the whiteboard, someone had left a joke from earlier: high potential or high maintenance, with 2 arrows pointing left and right. Celine erased it without a word, packed her things, and left the building into the dusk. Outside, the city glimmered beneath cloudless sky, but it all felt synthetic. She walked to her hotel in the darkening evening with the slow certainty of someone who had seen behind the curtain. Every humiliation was accumulating weight. The room was arranged in clusters of circular tables, all already half filled with interns, team leads, and senior staff eagerly clinging to small talk about projects they hadn't started and promotions they hadn't earned. The air smelled faintly of catered chicken wraps and synthetic cheese, with a deeper undercurrent of ego and hierarchy. Celine stood briefly at the doorway, scanning for an empty chair. There were none. Not at the regular tables. Not near the windows. Not by the drink station. Only one seat remained, tucked against the back corner near the maintenance hallway, next to a compost bin labeled "Organic, Waste Only" in faded marker. The air there hung heavy with the sour smell of leftover coffee grounds and warm produce. She hesitated for less than a second, then made her way toward it. No one offered a shift. No one made room. No one said a word. She placed her tray down and sat upright, adjusting the sleeve of her blazer with practice control, ignoring the sting of ammonia and vinegar floating up from the sanitation cart parked nearby. A few minutes into her silent meal, a burst of laughter erupted from a nearby table. One of the senior associates, a man named Trey Billings, who wore startup sneakers and false humility, leaned back in his chair and pointed loosely in Celine's direction. "For a second," he said, too loudly to be accidental, "I thought someone had mopped the floor with their shoes. Guess that's just what happens when you step into the deep end on day 3. The others laughed. No one looked at her directly. But Celine knew. She always knew when she was the punchline. Her shoes, ivory leather with a matte finish, bore faint discoloration near the heel where the rain had caught her on the walk from the garage. They were not dirty, just damp. But perception wasn't about truth. It was about narrative. And in that moment, Trey had chosen hers for her. She did not respond. She cut her wraps slowly, precisely, chewing with a calm that disguised the burn crawling up her throat. Across the room, someone clicked a photo of their sandwich and tagged it with the phrase "company culture vibes." No one captured the woman eating in the shadow of rotting oranges. After lunch, while the others returned to their departments, Celine was told to report to a temporary workstation while her official space was under configuration. That workstation turned out to be a collapsible desk wedged between the emergency exit and the break room supply cabinet. The only window was a frosted panel overlooking an alley. The noise from the vending machine buzzed incessantly. Her desk had no drawer, no network jack, no monitor. The keyboard sat at an uneven angle. She plugged in her laptop, sat down and worked. For hours. She wrote a proposal outline for a projected restructuring of the internal risk compliance framework, a task assigned broadly to the group, with no ownership delegated. She finished it by 3 p.m. No one had asked her to. No one would thank her for it. By the end of the day, the proposal had already been passed upward by a junior analyst, white male and loud, who had glanced at her screen earlier that afternoon and lifted her phrasing wholesale. His name was Cole Wexler. He received a shout-out on the company's Slack channel at 5:17 p.m., with Blythe Randall commenting, "Exceptional initiative." This is the kind of fast-thinking insight we expect from our future leads. Celine watched the message pop up as she packed her bag. Her name wasn't mentioned, not even in footnotes. That night, she returned to her hotel room and sat quietly in a chair beside the window, her laptop open on the side table, her fingers resting on the trackpad but not moving. The city skyline pulsed faintly through the blinds, and below, the glow of streetlights flickered across sidewalks she no longer found comfort in. Her reflection in the window looked back at her with tired, measured defiance. She did not cry. She did not scowl. But inside, the silence screamed. The next morning began with another micromove. At the print station on the 21st floor, she found a note taped above the copier. "Color printing limited to priority personnel. Ink is expensive. So are standards." No one else had a note above their machines. No one else had their queue paused with an error that required override approval. When she approached the IT desk, the technician, someone new, said with a shrug, "You're not on the default tier yet. Sorry, corporate hasn't whitelisted you." She asked when it would update. He laughed nervously and said, "Maybe when someone notices." Her onboarding had already passed. The system should have caught up. The tiers weren't a mystery, they were just an excuse. That afternoon, she received a message from facilities. Her official workstation had been reassigned again, this time to a desk in the storage corridor beside the mailroom. When she arrived, a stack of unused monitors blocked part of the wall. The air conditioning unit clicked loudly every 10 minutes. A sticker on the desk said temporary use only. Still, she sat down. She opened her laptop. She worked. She sent 2 memos, rewrote a case study, corrected 2 internal policy decks riddled with errors. She received 1 response. It was from legal. The subject line, "Watch tone in annotations." That evening, as she stood waiting for the elevator, a new hire she didn't know, someone who had watched the senior team laugh during lunch the day before, stood beside her. He said nothing for a full 30 seconds. The rest of the cohort filtered in, light chatter and paper cups in hand, the atmosphere easy and social for most. The chairs were arranged in a semicircle around a makeshift podium. Blythe entered at 8:58 sharp, clipboard in hand, lips pursed in mild satisfaction. She welcomed the group with a tone that echoed cheer but lacked warmth, then launched into an opening monologue about the value of self-awareness in leadership. She gestured toward the podium and explained the session structure. Each employee would be asked to stand, walk to the front, and share the one personal trait or accomplishment they believed best prepared them for impact in the organization. "Be bold," she said, "be concise, and show us who you are." It began smoothly enough. One man spoke about his time scaling a food bank in Denver. A woman discussed teaching herself Python during maternity leave. Another shared her experience turning around a failing startup in Boston. Each speaker received polite applause. But as Celine's turn approached, the room subtly tensed. Her name was called. She stood, her expression calm, and took the same route to the front as the others had. She turned to face the group. But before she could begin, Blythe raised a hand, almost theatrically. "Actually," Blythe said, eyes scanning her clipboard with exaggerated thought, "we're a little behind schedule. Maybe we'll circle back." The room stilled. Some looked at their watches. Others glanced sideways. But Celine remained poised, neither moving forward nor retreating. Blythe's voice grew lighter, more casual. "Unless it's something very quick. But let's not spend too much time on things that might not connect to today's objectives." There was a flicker of discomfort across the room. The meaning was clear. Celine had been disinvited without directly being silenced. She offered a slight nod, returned to her seat, and said nothing. The next few speakers continued, but the air had changed. When the final applause faded, Blythe closed the session with a reminder that professionalism meant knowing when to contribute and when to step back for the greater rhythm of the team. That afternoon, the team gathered again, this time in a collaborative session focused on customer engagement strategies. Blythe led the session, walking from table to table, engaging teams in mock dialogues and critique exercises. Celine's group had just begun discussing the tone and phrasing of voicemail scripts when Blythe arrived at their table, her energy theatrical. She pointed to the script in front of them and laughed. "This one's rich," she said. "Try reading that in the wrong voice, and it sounds like someone calling from housing assistance hotlines." She said it with a smirk, eyes briefly touching Celine's before glancing away. The others froze. A few chuckled awkwardly. One man cleared his throat. Celine's hand was still on the printed page, her index finger resting on the exact line Blythe had mocked. The implication was clear. Her voice, her cadence, her identity was incompatible with the company's polished sound. She did not respond. The conversation moved forward without pause. Blythe shifted her attention to another team, praising a suggestion from a less experienced hire who had fumbled most of the draft. Celine reviewed the document again. Her edits had been technical, grounded, articulate. Her annotations had been removed. Later that day, an internal bulletin was circulated celebrating the top 3 ideas from the workshop. One of them belonged to a concept Celine had introduced during early brainstorming. The credit was attributed to someone else. A note at the bottom read, "Presented by Andrew M. during Team Session 2B. Andrew had not contributed a single complete sentence during the session. She recognized the phrasing. She had written it into the margin notes while he scrolled on his phone. By the time Celine returned to her desk, a yellow sticky note was left on her keyboard. It read, "Let's find moments to amplify others. Good leadership starts with stepping back." No signature. The handwriting was Blythe's. That evening, Celine's access to the strategy server was suspended temporarily. When she messaged IT, they told her she had triggered a flag for excessive revision volume on draft documents. She had edited 2 documents. Both had typos. Both had inconsistencies in formatting. Both were now published under someone else's name. The next morning, she received feedback from an anonymous peer review survey. The score was meets expectations. The note read, "Strong technical acumen, but may benefit from focusing more on communication alignment with team culture." The meaning wasn't coded. It was clear. She didn't sound like them. She didn't speak like them. She didn't move through the space in the way that made others comfortable. That week, Celine was pulled from a presentation she had helped prepare with the explanation that the client might respond better to a more familiar face. The substitute was a new hire who asked her for a crash course 15 minutes before the meeting began. Celine gave it, thoroughly, precisely. When the presentation earned a company-wide mention from the CCO, no one mentioned who had built the material. No one needed to. By the end of Friday, the only person who hadn't spoken Celine's name aloud in over 4 days was Blythe. But every room Blythe walked into still echoed with her intent. The undermining wasn't subtle anymore. It had become part of the culture. The subject line read, "Image session assignment. All staff appearance required." There were no time slots to choose from. No personalization. Just a directive. Report to the marketing floor conference center at 10:30 a.m. sharp. She arrived 10 minutes early. The room was flooded with professional lights, collapsible white backdrops, racks of company-branded garments, and a team of 2 freelance photographers dressed in all black. Interns bustled around with lint rollers and combs, adjusting collars, powdering foreheads, murmuring praise to those they deemed photogenic. The line of participants moved slowly, a conveyor belt of confidence and corporate polish. When it was Celine's turn, an assistant approached her with an apologetic smile and handed her a blazer that was clearly several sizes too large, dated and cut, and faded at the seams. The label had been blacked out with marker. She paused, looking down at the garment, then up at the assistant. "Do you have another option?" she asked evenly. The assistant glanced at her clipboard, avoided eye contact, and replied, "This was the one set aside for your proportions. Sorry, it's just that we couldn't find a blazer that suits your frame." The implication was wrapped in sugar, but stung like salt. Celine accepted it without another word. She slipped it on. The sleeves swallowed her wrists. The shoulders drooped unevenly. She stood in front of the camera while the photographer adjusted the lighting, then hesitated. He tilted his head, looked her over, and said softly, "Let's shoot from a slightly higher angle. It'll minimize structural heaviness." She understood immediately. He didn't mean the blazer. The camera clicked anyway. 3 frames. No direction. No retakes. "That'll do," he said. "Thanks." She returned the blazer to the rack, folded her own coat over her arm, and stepped out of the studio into the hall, where 2 interns with matching Trivance polos were joking softly by the water cooler. As she passed, one of them lowered his voice, leaned toward the other, and whispered just loud enough for it to find her, "If I ever get that big, just put me on a fasting plan." The other laughed. Celine didn't pause, didn't break stride, but she heard every syllable. That afternoon, the company held a catering preview event for the annual summit. Employees were encouraged to try sample dishes and vote on their favorites. The buffet table stretched across the atrium with options labeled light, moderate, energy forward, and legacy indulgence. A woman from the design team nudged Celine gently while gesturing to the dessert tray. "You might want to skip that," she said in a tone that feigned friendship. "You know, for optics. A little less now could mean a lot more later." Celine stared at the woman for half a second, not long enough to give her the dignity of full attention. Then she turned and reached for a glass of water. Later, in the HR corner of the internal network, Celine noticed a bulletin had gone up titled "Health is Brand." It included photos of employees smiling in gym selfies, jogging by the river, and sipping green smoothies under corporate banners. The only mention of inclusion came as a footnote: "We welcome all body journeys, but we encourage transformation that mirrors leadership expectations." That night, as she left the building, Celine passed by the security desk and paused as the guard opened his mouth, as if to say something, then seemed to think better of it. She nodded politely and exited. The rain hadn't started, but the sky was already heavy with warning. Back at her hotel room, she changed into loose cotton, removed her earrings, and stood barefoot at the window watching the city move beneath a sky slowly turning copper. She thought of the photographer's lens, the blazer, the comment about her structure, the whisper in the hallway, the buffet woman's smirk, all of it chipped at the same wall, not to destroy it, but to deform her shape inside it. The strategy wasn't new. It was rooted in erasure by erosion, make her body seem excessive, her voice abrasive, her ambition misplaced, and her presence uncomfortable. A casual hallway comment between 2 interns mentioned a brainstorming session scheduled in the West Tower Conference Suite, an off-limits floor typically reserved for high-level client showcases and C-suite briefings. The tone was excited, exclusive, almost reverent. One intern described the space as glass-wrapped power. When Celine cross-referenced her calendar, the slot was blank. No invite, no memo, no notification. She asked another trainee about the session, keeping her voice neutral. The reply was hesitant, confused. "You weren't on the list?" Later that day, Celine sent a polite email to HR CCing Blythe, requesting clarification. Within 30 minutes, Blythe herself appeared at her desk, smile brittle, voice artificially light. "Oh," she said, "that session wasn't aligned with your development focus. We're curating experiences based on fit, and honestly, that room's dynamic requires a certain fluidity. I didn't want you to feel misaligned in that kind of atmosphere." Her words were syrup over steel. What she meant was, you don't belong in a room where decisions are shaped. Celine nodded without reaction. She saved the email trail. She saved the timestamps. The next morning, she was instructed via auto message to retrieve her permanent security access badge from the lobby. Everyone else had received theirs during the first onboarding week. At the desk, the receptionist looked at her, blinked, typed something, then reached beneath the counter. She handed Celine a yellow badge encased in hard plastic. It was visibly distinct from the standard black badges worn by everyone else. Celine turned it over slowly. The receptionist's smile faded slightly. That one's coded for temporary and supervised access. It's usually assigned to interns with limited clearance or external contractors. Maybe there was a system error. Celine said nothing. She took the badge, clipped it to her blazer, and walked away. In the elevator, 2 employees glanced at it. One arched a brow. The other looked away. She noticed the expression. She noted the moment. That afternoon, while reviewing reports in the break room turned pseudo office she's still occupied, a facility staff member arrived carrying a file cabinet meant for another department. He looked at her confused. They told me this was a storage zone. She gestured silently to her laptop. Not storage. Active use. He shrugged, apologized, and rolled the cabinet away. A few hours later, a junior analyst emailed a request for data consolidation on a project Celine had built and submitted 2 weeks earlier. Her original file had been deleted from the shared drive. A new version now bore someone else's name. When she traced the metadata, the audit trail stopped 3 days prior. No one had flagged the revision. No one had asked for edits. It simply vanished. In the elevator that evening, a group of mid-level managers stepped in as the doors opened. One woman in a tan dress gave a tight smile and said, "You're in the yellow tier, right? What's that protocol again? Are you allowed on level 5 unescorted?" The tone was falsely curious, as if she were asking about building codes, not hierarchy. Celine pressed the button for level 3 and didn't answer. Back at the hotel, she took off her badge and placed it on the desk. The yellow glint under the lamp reminded her of caution tape. A barrier. A warning. A symbol. She picked it up again and opened a private document, her running list of infractions. She added a new entry. 6:09 p.m. issued yellow badge. Deviation from standard issue. No explanation provided. Implication: restricted trust. She didn't flinch as she typed. She didn't shake. Her keystrokes were deliberate. That night, as she tried to sleep, the thoughts came faster than dreams. The voices, the glances, the pattern. Every moment was stitched into a fabric designed to suffocate without pressure, tight enough to restrict, loose enough to avoid detection. The next morning, as she walked into the building, her badge buzzed at the turnstile but didn't unlock. A security officer stepped over, checked her ID, then keyed her through manually. "Your clearance level was adjusted," he said. "Just temporary, I'm sure." But he didn't sound sure. She reached her floor and found a handwritten notice taped to her door. "Conference room, reserved, do not enter until cleared." She hadn't reserved it. She wasn't informed. Her workspace was gone. Her laptop had been moved to a hot desk hub near the janitorial closet. Her name was missing from the day's attendance log. She sat down anyway. She logged in. She opened her files. She wrote an internal memo titled "Breach of Workstation Consistency." She BCC'd it to herself. That afternoon, she received a wellness check email from HR. The message was short. "We noticed a dip in your engagement metrics. Are you feeling disconnected from your team?" The irony burned like acid. She drafted no reply. Not yet. But she saved the email, flagged it, numbered it. By now, every insult had become evidence. Every brush off, every technicality, every shadow of a policy not written down was part of the case she was quietly building. They thought they were boxing her in. The receptionist offered a nod that didn't quite meet her eyes, and the elevator ride up to the executive floor felt slower than usual, as if time itself hesitated to usher in what was coming. She stepped into the main corridor wearing a midnight blue suit tailored with sharp lines and authority, a small folder in her hand and an unreadable calm in her face. Around her, office chatter thinned. A few employees looked up from their desks, their eyes narrowing slightly before darting away. Her presence didn't yet register as a threat. It was merely confusing, the kind of anomaly their brains tried to file away as a scheduling glitch. They would learn better soon. Outside the main boardroom, 2 senior associates stood talking about logistics for the signing event, their voices low but confident. One of them glanced at Celine and paused for a beat, confused by her direction. She didn't explain herself. She didn't have to. A few seconds later, The executive assistant to the CEO stepped forward, eyes scanning the small group assembled, and then turned toward Celine with deliberate precision. "You're needed inside," he said. No one else in the hallway received such an invitation. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere had already shifted. Sleek oak panels, polished chrome fixtures, and a centerpiece table built to intimidate. Around it sat representatives from both Trivance and their high-profile investment partner. Executives in silk ties, CFOs in minimalist frames, legal advisors with tablets aglow. A few glanced up as Celine entered. Some straightened in their seats. The assistant walked her to the front, then cleared his throat and announced her presence not as a footnote, but as the anchor of the meeting. "Please welcome Ms. Celine Ward, Lead Strategic Compliance Auditor for Dixon Kerr Investments." The silence that followed was deafening. Blythe, seated midway down the table, turned with a polite smile that immediately cracked when the words registered. Her fingers stiffened on the pen she held, and her jaw tightened under the weight of recognition. Across from her, a man in a navy suit, one of the Dixon Kerr partners, stood up and extended a hand toward Celine. "Glad to see you again," he said. "We've been awaiting your final summary before we proceed." Celine nodded calmly, placed her folder on the table, and took the open seat at the head reserved for the lead auditor. No one dared question it. The shift in gravity was palpable. People who had once overlooked her now recalibrated in real time. The woman they had dismissed as a diversity hire, a misplaced file, an oversized silhouette in the margins of their polished ecosystem, was now the final gatekeeper to a $1.9 billion deal. Blythe's breathing grew shallow. She glanced around the room, hoping to catch the eye of an ally, a justification, a way to excuse herself from what was rapidly becoming exposure. But there was no one to save her. Celine opened the folder, retrieved a printed copy of her internal findings, and handed them across the table to the legal liaison from Dixon Kerr. Her voice was even, controlled, measured by years of practice and pain. She did not raise her volume. She did not need to. Every eye was fixed on her. Every breath was bated. She began by outlining the scope of her audit, describing the intention of her internal visit, framed officially as a culture alignment verification process, part of Dixon Kerr's standard due diligence before partnership execution. She explained the methodology, the anonymous interviews, the audit trail of internal communications, and the patterns of organizational behavior that flag concerns. Her words were technical but human, objective but cutting. She did not mention names, not yet. She did not point fingers, yet. She laid out a structure, a narrative, a map of misconduct so finely detailed that no one could mistake it for rumor or emotion. One executive attempted to interject, saying perhaps the data had been misunderstood or taken out of context. Celine paused, turned to him, and responded with a single line that carried the weight of every slight she had endured in silence. Context is not an excuse for systems that reward humiliation. The room fell quiet again. The documents circulated. Page after page of annotated evidence, compliance red flags, and statements that painted a damning portrait of a corporate culture deeply misaligned with ethical investment standards. When Celine closed her folder and leaned back in her chair, the room felt different. Not just still, but exposed. The mask had been lifted, and those who had sculpted their power through exclusion now sat trembling before a woman they believed powerless. Blythe's eyes locked on Celine, but there was no recognition anymore, only fear. Not of retribution, but of consequence. Not of the woman herself, but of what she represented. Celine didn't offer her the dignity of eye contact. Not yet. She turned instead to the Dixon Kerr lead and said, "My recommendation is to pause engagement pending internal remediation. There are severe integrity concerns that undermine this organization's readiness for strategic alignment." He nodded. "Understood. We'll take that under advisement immediately." The meeting concluded without a single objection, not even from Blythe. As the executive stood and filtered out in uneasy silence, Celine remained seated. On the 22nd floor, Blythe sat frozen at her desk, hands clasped tightly, eyes darting to the unopened Slack notifications that had begun flooding in. She tried to keep her breath steady, tried to regain the script she had so long controlled. But the dialogue was no longer hers. Celine returned to her temporary workspace, not out of necessity, but as a final gesture to the architecture of the system that had once treated her as invisible. She sat down, opened her laptop, and composed a single encrypted email to the Dixon Kerr Executive Board. The subject line was clear: Final Cultural Risk Assessment Report. The file attached was comprehensive. It included timeline logs, access violations, documented patterns of hostile conduct, and anonymized employee testimonies that highlighted a pervasive culture of subtle degradation and conditional inclusion. The appendix carried a section titled Case Pattern: Internal Sabotage and Image Manipulation, citing specific moments when Celine's work had been appropriated, when her voice had been silenced, and when her very presence had been rewritten by others for the comfort of those in power. She did not name herself. She did not have to. The system had already written her name in margins deep enough to be recognized without signature. She sent the file, then closed her laptop and walked quietly to the executive floor once more. This time, no one asked her why. She entered the glass conference suite where Dixon Kerr had reconvened their team and requested to speak briefly before any further actions were taken. Her demeanor was exact, her gaze level, her words deliberate. She presented a printed copy of the report summary and turned to the key investors seated along the far side of the room. With no need for theatricality, she began to read excerpts aloud. Employee number 1047 describes the onboarding experience as acutely isolating, structured around reminders of their otherness, and defined by administrative slow walks used to hinder access and credibility. She flipped a page. Incident number 8. A senior HR executive joking about the candidate's weight in the presence of interns and failing to acknowledge the candidate's name during group introductions. Another page turned. Internal bulletin messaging suggests health initiatives that prioritize aesthetics over well-being, marginalizing certain body types while masking exclusion under brand image. The room was silent. A few Dixon Kerr advisors scribbled notes, but most simply listened, the gravity thick in the air. She continued. During a photo session, the subject was provided with a mismatched blazer, then photographed from an angle described as necessary to minimize visual heaviness. The footage confirms intent. She paused, not for effect, but to breathe slowly and fully before delivering the line that brought the weight of all previous indignities into legal clarity. These patterns are not isolated incidents. They are institutional defaults, rehearsed through custom, not policy. This is not a personnel issue. It is a leadership liability. One of the investment leads leaned forward, brows furrowed in thought, then looked at his colleague with a tight nod. Celine closed the report gently. It is my recommendation that Dixon Kerr suspend all further partnership proceedings with Trivand Solutions until demonstrable remediation has been conducted and externally validated. No one challenged her. No one raised a counterpoint. The moment had shifted too definitively. Across the table, the lead partner of Dixon Kerr rose to his feet and adjusted his tie, then spoke not to Celine, but to the room. In light of the findings presented, we are initiating an immediate freeze on all contractual commitments with Trivand. Our office will prepare a statement within the hour. Within 30 minutes, a confidential notice was delivered to the Trivand Executive Board announcing the indefinite suspension of the $1.9 billion acquisition. The public statement followed not long after. The language was careful but resolute, citing culture risk misalignment, governance instability, and concerns regarding ethical stewardship. Celine watched from the mezzanine floor as phones rang, meetings were canceled, and a flurry of activity erupted among upper management. Panic was no longer whispered. It was vocal, visible, tangible. Blight's office door closed, locked, reopened. The general counsel arrived minutes later. The HR team began reviewing emails from weeks past. Security badge access logs were requested. Internal chat archives opened. At 4:22 p.m., the news broke on industry platforms. Headlines used terms like seismic collapse, cultural liability, institutional failure. Analysts predicted a stock dip. Clients began dialing back renewals. No official statement named her, but inside the organization, everyone now knew. The woman they had ignored, insulted, minimized, was the one who had changed the course of their future in a single, surgically precise motion. At 5:11 p.m., Celine exited the building. No elevator small talk, no polite waves, no scripted smiles. She stepped out into the early evening light, the city's pulse vibrating through the sidewalks beneath her heels. In her phone, messages from allies began to trickle in, some from Dixon Kerr, others from junior staffers who had once looked through her. The inboxes of directors blinked red with unread alerts, and the normally buoyant company Slack channels turned desolate, with messages hovering unanswered, lingering like debris from a storm that had yet to pass. By 8 a.m., the internal portal flashed a company-wide message, leadership update pending. The phrase was sterile, stripped of detail, but everyone understood what it meant. Blythe arrived shortly after, her gait measured, her expression blank. She passed by the reception without her usual clipped nods or remarks, climbed to the executive floor, and found her access card denied at the final door. A temporary security officer stepped forward, silent, and handed her a sealed envelope. Inside was a formal notification from the board's Risk Ethics Committee, citing an urgent requirement for her resignation, pending a full-scale investigation into her conduct. Her name had been flagged in multiple audit threads and cross-referenced with anonymous staff surveys submitted during Celine's covert review. Each complaint once dismissed as exaggerated or too vague had now been given new weight. The envelope contained a deadline: noon. By 9:30, the news had unofficially reached every division. Whispered messages passed between floors, and employees who once mimicked Blythe's clipped professionalism now kept their distance, as if her proximity might stain them. One member of the compliance team was overheard saying, "She's radioactive," before retreating into a closed-door meeting. The HR department, once a fortress of curated indifference, found itself under siege. Blythe's second-in-command was placed on leave by noon. 3 other managers were pulled into closed sessions with external auditors. Internal chat transcripts from the past 6 months were reviewed line by a third-party ethics firm retained by Dixon Kerr to assess cultural volatility. Simultaneously, financial markets reacted. Trivent stock, once buoyed by rumors of the Dixon Kerr acquisition, plummeted. Analysts used terms like brand erosion and governance exposure. Clients scheduled emergency calls with account leads. 2 international partners paused contract renewals, citing cultural misalignment risks. By the afternoon, 5 major clients had formally withdrawn from future engagement discussions, citing reputational uncertainty. The legal team issued a draft holding statement for the media, but the tone was evasive, hollow, and immediately picked apart by industry watchdogs. At 3 p.m., a leak emerged. An anonymous source, almost certainly internal, shared excerpts from Celine's report with a respected tech news outlet. The excerpts detailed dehumanizing onboarding practices, coded language in internal memos, and statistical discrepancies in promotion rates across demographic lines. The article went live within the hour. It went viral before sunset. Headlines across the digital business world screamed variations of the same theme: silent sabotage, the diversity facade, corporate inclusion or institutional erosion. The images used were carefully selected. Stock photos of cold glass buildings, diversity posters, and ironically, an outdated image of Blythe smiling beside a quote that read, "We don't just hire talent, we shape it." Comments beneath the article ranged from outrage to vindication. Former employees came forward with their own stories. Anonymous forums lit up with posts describing eerily similar treatment, naming names, confirming patterns. What had once been seen as isolated grievances now formed a clear pattern. Blythe, who had once controlled the narrative of what was appropriate, what was strategic, what was professional, now found herself at the center of a corporate implosion that could not be undone. Her public profile was scrubbed by the end of the day. By nightfall, her name had been removed from the executive leadership page. Her contact access was revoked. Her official resignation was issued via a short press release that did not include a quote from her. The board statement was longer, citing the need to restore organizational trust and rebuild from within. But trust was not a faucet. It did not turn back on with the firing of one name. The damage extended deeper. Departments reported a surge in internal complaints previously withheld. Exit interviews were re-requested. 2 former employees filed wrongful termination suits citing retaliatory behavior linked to race and gender. Celine's name remained absent from all of it. She had not spoken publicly, had not appeared in any interviews. Her silence had become legendary, proof of control, of strategy, of a justice not delivered in screams, but in structure. Meanwhile, junior staff began forming their own channels, creating anonymous discussion forums to protect themselves and prepare for the next wave of scrutiny. Managers began avoiding eye contact in halls, suddenly interested in employee morale, suddenly curious about unconscious bias. The culture had turned brittle. No one knew who would be next. In one whispered conversation, a team lead said, "This isn't just about her. It's about all of us who laughed when we should have spoken." By 10 p.m., an internal list had begun circulating titled Survivor's Manifesto, a document compiled by employees who had once felt alone, now seeing patterns, connecting dots, drafting demands. Wacth had become the case study no one wanted to be. 1 year later, the headlines that once flared like sirens had long since faded into footnotes, buried beneath newer scandals, fresher collapses, and the relentless churn of news cycles that feed on the downfall of the powerful. But for those who had been inside Wacth, for those who had built careers on silence, and for those who had lost sleep over complicity, the memory of what happened had never truly dulled. On a gray spring morning, in a modest auditorium tucked between renovated libraries and mid-rise universities, a gathering took place that few might have predicted a year earlier. The event was titled Rebuilding Leadership, From Collapse to Conscience, a summit organized by a nonprofit focused on ethical reintegration and restorative workplace culture. Among the list of panelists was a name that once inspired ambition, and then fear, Blythe Randall. She arrived without fanfare, carrying a plain leather tote and wearing an unstructured blazer in slate gray, her hair no longer razor cut, her heels replaced with soft leather flats. No longer an architect of curated power, she looked smaller, not in stature, but in presence. When she took the stage, there was a moment of silence, not born from reverence, but from unease. Some attendees remembered her. Others only knew the name from articles and internal training materials, now used as cautionary tales. Blythe stepped to the podium, glanced briefly at her notes, then looked into the crowd without smiling. Her voice, once sharp and calculating, had softened, tempered not by shame, but by exhaustion. She began her talk not with defense, but with admission. She recounted her rise, her years in corporate culture, her obsession with metrics of performance and polish, and the deep, invisible lines she had drawn between those she deemed worthy and those she did not. She didn't name Celine. She didn't need to, but she spoke of a woman, a colleague, who she had treated as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be understood. She called it blindness disguised as leadership. She described how the moment she lost control was the moment she began to see. She described waking up every morning after her resignation with the same recurring thought: I was the reason someone had to fight in silence. The room remained still. No applause. No immediate forgiveness. Just air thick with recognition. She ended her segment by saying that power had taught her very little, but its absence had forced her to confront everything. Her final line echoed without theatrics: there is no justice in being forgiven. There is only justice in changing who you are after you've been revealed. As she stepped down, a new speaker was announced. Celine Ward walked across the stage not in retaliation, not in triumph, but in clarity. She had not spoken publicly in the months since the collapse of Wacth. She had declined interviews, turned down feature profiles, and rejected offers to consult on anti-bias training programs commodified by the very systems they claimed to reform. But she had accepted this one invitation, not because she sought a spotlight, but because the story was still unfinished. Dressed in deep indigo, her posture straight, her presence as poised as ever, she took the podium and paused. The audience leaned in, not out of curiosity, but out of weight. They knew what they had come to witness. They just weren't sure what it would feel like. Celine began not with blame, but with truth. She spoke of the quiet architecture of exclusion, of how systems are not built to crush with force, but to erode through patterns. She described the pain not of being hated, but of being rendered invisible. She explained that for her, justice was never about watching others fall. It was about making sure the floor they fell through was never built again. Then, in a moment no one expected, she turned to Blythe, who was seated near the edge of the stage, and invited her to stand beside her. There was no embrace, no tearful reconciliation, just two women standing in the gravity of their shared history. Celine addressed the audience again, her voice unwavering. Accountability without annihilation. That is where we begin again. The crowd, silent until then, rose slowly in a standing ovation, not for performance, but for what had been endured, exposed, and ultimately transformed. That evening, the clip circulated online, not through tabloids or pundits, but through forums, newsletters, and small internal HR groups that passed it along with notes that read, "This is what growth can look like." Celine didn't return to Trivance. The company had long since restructured, rebranded, and replaced every inch of its public image. She continued her work quietly, consulting on governance reform, helping institutions build systems that see people before roles. Blythe, on the other hand, spent her days working with a nonprofit that focused on ethical repair. She wasn't celebrated. She wasn't crucified. She was simply rebuilding. And sometimes that was enough. Not every story ends with applause or ruin. Some end with silence, with a pause, with the steady, uncertain steps of those who were once blind, now choosing to look inward. Justice didn't wear robes or swing gavels in this story. It wore reflection. It moved in whispers. It changed the ending not by crushing villains, but by exposing a system that made them possible. And in the quiet after the storm, where names had once been erased and voices once suppressed, something unexpected bloomed. Not redemption, not revenge, but recognition. And in that recognition, maybe, just maybe, something like hope. The end. If this story moved you, take a second to like the video and subscribe for more powerful narratives like this. What part hit you the hardest? And where are you watching from? Drop a comment. We read every one.